As our publicity for this event noted, Australia's housing is now recognised as amongst the world's best. It's young, spacious and well built. Yet our ageing population, relentless suburban expansion and rising incidence of low-income housing stress are raising significant social and economic questions. Can we continue to favour infrastructure-intensive, low-density sprawl over high-density urban living? What are the societal implications of homelessness due to surging housing costs? What expectations will the relatively affluent baby boomers have of their accommodation in old age, and how should they be addressed? I suspect we're in for an evening that will be lively. Hopefully it will generate some controversy and challenging. And I hope also that this evening we might move the debate beyond the dichotomies of density versus suburban sprawl, either or, good or bad. And I hope this will be achieved with a panel of experts we have assembled for this event. As Mike announced, we've got 4 panellists, and it's my pleasure to firstly introduce Dr. Debbie Faulkner, of course, who is a research fellow for CHIRP. Debbie has many years' experience in social and population-based research issues with a strong focus and expertise in understanding the housing and care needs of our older population. Her current research projects include understanding the impact of different levels of intervention in addressing social exclusion or isolation, amongst the older population, examining the community participation of older South Australians, and the effect purpose-built accommodation has on well-being, health and survival of older people. And of course, importantly, understanding the pathways of older people into emergency departments. And Debbie will address the theme of older. Would you like to come up?
Sure.
So in doing so, Debbie will offer insights into current characteristics and projections for our older populations in relation to housing options.
Thank you, Susan. So, our city's populations are ageing, and we need to understand the expectations and behaviours of the baby boomers because they will have an impact on our housing market. At present, however, we have only a limited understanding of the motivations and behaviours of the baby boomers in terms of what's driving their housing decisions and the options that they will make. We must remember that the baby boomers span 20, or the baby boomer generation spans 20 years, so those at the beginning may have very different circumstances and outlooks to those born at the end of the baby booms. So what do we know? We know that the baby boomers are a quarter of the Australian population. The older population, aged 65 and over at the moment, is about 14% of the population. We know that they have a projected longer life expectancy and potential a longer period of retirement than the current older population. And we often hear that they're healthier and wealthier. The current population, aged 65 years and over, at the last census, 19% had a profound or severe disability. Now we expect that the baby boomers are healthier, but recent research carried out by Professor Graham Hugo and Professor Whittet here at the University of Adelaide has shown that the health of the baby boomers is actually poorer than that of the current older population at the same age. For example, obesity in the baby boomer population is 2 times that of the current age of their parents, so of the current age population now. The experience of 3 or more chronic conditions is 700% higher amongst the baby boomers. Asthma is twice as high. So monitoring the health of the baby boomers into the future will have an impact on service provision because of illness and disability. The baby boomers do hold most of the nation's wealth, but there is significant disparities within the baby boomer generation. So those at the top own 60% of the wealth, much of it in housing, and those at the bottom hold only 4% of the baby boomer wealth. They are better educated and more well-travelled, so they have greater familiarity with a range of areas rather than just their local area. They live in lower density suburbs than the current older population. There will be and there are a significant number of lone person households, And as we expect, they have greater aspirations and expectations than the previous generation. So this graph shows that over time, less baby boomers will be homeowners at the age of 65 than the current older population. A significant number and proportion will enter older age or enter the retirement years holding a mortgage, never having been a homeowner or having fallen out of home ownership. This means there'll be increasing demands placed on the rental sector. By 2028, it's projected that across Australia we will need 500,000 rental properties. Many of these will need to be located in the private rental market, and this will have a significant impact on older people's health and well-being. I've gone the wrong way. So our current indications are that the baby boomers and older people's attitudes to home and community are complex. We have little evidence to suggest there's a rush to downsizing, and if there is, it's more towards medium density housing rather than high density. We have little evidence that retirees will move back to the centre of the city. We need housing that provides a range of choices that appeal to older people and the community in general. Older people want what everyone else in the community wants in terms of their housing. We need housing that's affordable. We need housing that is age-friendly. Age-friendly means housing that has universal design features. We need some housing that has forms of care options available. We need housing that's located in the current localities that the baby boomers are located. And it needs to be located close to services and facilities, in particular transport. And just to show in comparison where the baby boomers live in comparison to the current age population, as you can see from this map from the 2011 census, the current age population is located around the inner suburbs. Whereas when you look at the baby boomers, they're much more spread across the metropolitan area, and that has implications for housing and service provision.
Thank you, Debbie. Can I ask Andrew to take the stand? Podium. Andrew has a long history of research in urban issues, including work in both metropolitan and non-metropolitan Australia. Andrew is an expert in urban economic development and has published numerous journal articles and books on the topic. Much of his work has focused on the relationship between urban planning and the economic performance of cities. Andrew's work also includes research on urban regeneration, locational disadvantage, the growth of outer metropolitan areas, the needs of employers in less developed regions, and the supply of land for urban development. Andrew will address the theme of poorer, and Andrew will be offering insights into the future of our cities, housing and housing affordability.
Thank you, Susan. Older.Poorer.Denser, and I score poorer. Lucky me. I want to think about the future of our cities and the future about our housing. You only have to ask a motorist and they'll tell you that our roads are inadequate. You only have to ask a bus user and be told that our public transport here in Adelaide is inadequate. You only have to read the third page of the Advertiser today to know that we have significant gaps in our housing. So what does the future hold? Will the ageing of the baby boomer generation perhaps open up new opportunities for our future? Will it release a vast stock of housing to accommodate our growing population, if it is to grow? And will it generate changes where we all benefit in the long term? But if we look to the future, what we see is a set of challenges, I would suggest to you, around the future of our cities and housing. Let's think about the public sector. Australian governments at the moment, state and federal, are concerned about the size of the deficits, and I think there's a resonance within the population that the size of deficits held by many governments is a political issue. But we need to recognise that over the last 5 years we've had significant investment in our housing, our cities and our regions, which has worked to the benefit of all Australians and in many ways has filled a gap created by 11 years of underinvestment, or even 20 years of underinvestment, stretching back to the time of the Hawke-Keating governments from 1983. Over the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen significant investment in a range of programs, including the Nation Building Economic Stimulus Program, National Affordable Housing Program, National Rental Affordability Scheme, National Parliament Agreement on Homelessness, and I'll let you read the rest. These have been significant programs with significant funds that have made a real difference to the lives of many within Australian society, particularly those at greatest disadvantage because of their location, because of their low income, because of their disability, etc. We've also seen significant investment in infrastructure funding, and we only have to look around Adelaide to see the depth and scope of that investment. The new RAH, the South Road upgrades, the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, the investment in a new tram system, etc., etc. But these are projects that may well come to an end soon, and the termination of these projects creates challenges for our cities and, most importantly, for our housing stock. We have a crisis now in our housing with new investment in social housing. What will it look like in 5 years' time? Does the private sector offer us a solution? It wasn't so long ago that the Reserve Bank of Australia, that august institution and that wonderful analyst of the Australian economy, was arguing that the mining boom in Australia was here to stay for 30 years or more. There was no foreseeable future where it would not be booming. That once the demand for resources from China came to an end, India would then kick in and continue to demand our resources at record levels. But we don't talk about that anymore. We've also seen as a consequence the loss of manufacturing and retailing industries, with a litany of major closures including Ford, Mitsubishi, Kimberly-Clark, Bridgestone, BlueScope Steel, Electrolux, etc. And many of our agricultural industries have suffered as greatly as the manufacturing industries, if not more. And one outcome has been a patchwork economy that favours few cities and few regions. And we have to think also that poverty continues to persist in Australian cities. Approximately 90,000 Australians are homeless on any night. 90,000 Australians tonight will be homeless in some sense. On any 360,000 Australians will be homeless at some stage during 2013. And if we think about household incomes, we note that almost 14% of Adelaide households have household incomes of less than $20,000 or $20,800, and almost 24% have household incomes under $31,200. These are very, very low incomes, speaking to very profound disadvantage. The public sector remains challenged into the future. The private sector does not seem to offer a solution. And what we see is a housing sector which is marked by ongoing crisis of affordability. And where does these crises come from? They come in part from a shortage of supply. The National Housing Supply Council 2010, 2011, 2012 talks about large and ongoing shortfalls in the supply of housing. And if you look at the graph on the left of the screen, you see that this crisis is growing rapidly and is accelerating away from us. Soon, the gap will be so great that we may look at a future where we will never overcome the shortfall in housing stock in Australia. And what does that mean for individuals? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for your children? What does that mean for your grandchildren? It means that some of them will pay 60% or more of their gross household income in rent or mortgage payments, mainly rent. Severe and profound disadvantage to the point where people will go without food because otherwise they cannot pay their rent and be evicted. 1.1 million households across Australia are in housing stress nationally, and this is a percentage that continues to, a number and a percentage that continues to grow. So what can we conclude? Well, 4% of the housing stock in Australia is social housing. But where does the bottom 15% of the income distribution live? The private rental market is unaffordable, the social housing stock is small, home ownership is unaffordable and inaccessible. Cities, towns and regions need to pay their own way, But many places across Australia have poor futures marked by low incomes, rising unemployment, reduced competitiveness and limited infrastructure investment. And an economy marked by booms and busts doesn't help them create a long-term future for their benefit. We'll all be poorer if future governments choose to turn their back on our cities, regions and housing. And in part, we should recognise that this is an ongoing and enduring task for governments to deliver for us, the Australian people. We need to build competitive places, we need to invest in our future, we need to reform our economy and government processes where necessary, and most importantly, we need to have planning systems that provide a platform for investment and facilitate the provision of affordable housing, because without housing, none of us have a future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Chris Paris is a specialist in housing and planning research and has held other research and teaching positions at the University of Canberra, at ANU, teaching positions at the University in Centre of Environmental Studies London and the University of Birmingham. Chris has held visiting professorships at RMIT and Hong Kong universities and visiting fellowships in many other universities, including the ANU, La Trobe, Flinders, Cambridge and Oxford. Chris has wide international experience of scholarly and applied research, particularly in the area of multiple home ownership in affluent societies and the housing needs of older people, which is the part of his current research. Chris will address the theme of denser. Can I ask Chris to come forward? Chris takes up the argument that he made 20 years ago, that there may be little choice other than to increase urban densities.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? I guess I'm one of the baby boomers. And I've got the easy topic to talk about because whatever I say, someone's going to be really unhappy. So I can't try to please everybody today. Like Debbie, I'll start by asking, what do we know? All Australian governments in their metropolitan plans say that they want urban consolidation. They've been saying this for a very long time. But in fact, what's been happening, despite some higher density infill, is that across metropolitan areas as a whole, population densities have been falling. Certainly in the 80s. In the 1990s, the proportion of detached homes was increasing. And in the 2000s, most metropolitan growth in Australia was in the outer areas of all metropolitan areas. Why? Why have we had all these plans, but the aspirations in the plans have not come to fruition? Well, I think there are 2 or 3 pretty good reasons. And the first is that there are actually lower costs involved in producing low-rise homes on the fringes. Australians want home ownership, and those who can afford it want large detached houses. And I think there's no political wish to push densification by regulation or infrastructure provision. So where are we going? Well, Adelaide has a 30-year plan which focuses on transit-oriented development with a strong north-south direction, and it's got elements that say there are planned urban lands and new strategic employment lands. Reading this plan, I don't get any sense that there is a strong, determined push to ensure denser development. What's happening with strategic transport infrastructure? Absolutely crucial. The provision of infrastructure is one lever that governments can pull. What are the new jobs that are going for the new strategic employment lands, following from Professor Beer's questions in relation to the changing nature of the economy? And I could ask, will population grow by 500,000? I'm not sure. Where could we go if we were really determined to have higher densities? We could focus more on higher densities. There are a range of policy levers that governments could pull. Could put a strict green belt around metropolitan areas. Say, no more development outside of here. We could impose massive anti-car restrictions, a really heavy congestion charge. And we could, if we wished, have strategic high-density projects. For example, we might think about replacing the airport with new density transit-oriented development and add high-rise parks development. Adelaide Airport is a very valuable land near the CBD with little room for airport-related economic activities. There's even a risk, low level admittedly, of a catastrophic crash. And the airport's current location limits high-rise development in the CBD. So we could think about new transitory development, suburbs, lively living areas in the parklands, but I don't really think anybody would go with that. That would be massively resisted, so it won't happen. So where could we go? One option is pretty much what most Australian cities have been doing for most of the last 30 years, which is the suburban option with its capacity to deliver affordable housing for first-time buyers, with a high-quality north-south freeway, which enables people to trade off commuting for home ownership. And perhaps we could accept that there is de facto a current freeway corridor. And we might think about linking the southeastern freeway to a high-quality north-south freeway, probably along Green Hill Road, though some might object to that, with new higher density housing beside an elevated freeway. We could relocate the airport to expand and prosper. There are good coastal models in Osaka and Hong Kong, and inland models in Kuala Lumpur and Amsterdam. I'm not sure we're going to do that. What should we do? There doesn't really appear to be any desire for a significantly denser metropolitan Adelaide. And I am a qualified planner. I've been a corporate planner for over 30 years. But I have to say that planning is much better at stopping things happen than making it happen. And so strategic planning is often very little more than wishful thinking with nice artwork. Now, government can make strategic decisions about infrastructure investment. That's one of the levers that governments really do have control over. Now, the outcomes of new infrastructure are not entirely predictable. But the pros and cons of the lower density suburban option are at least worth thinking about. What are the advantages? A predictable spatial direction of infrastructure provision. A highly probable delivery of additional affordable housing. Suburban life is popular. Most of us live in suburbs and want to carry on doing so. And one of the advantages for government is that households bear the cost of commuting. Now that's an advantage for all taxpayers. Same time, it's a disadvantage for households. You've got to bear that cost. There are risks of escalating costs of infrastructure provision, but one of the great things about infrastructure is that, and this approach to planning, is that you don't have to commit it all at one go. It can be incremental and developmental. There would be social and environmental impacts of additional commuting, and there would be loss of farmland and other environmental impacts. That's it.
Thank you, Chris. After leaving university, Nathan worked for the Honourable Paul Holloway before turning to public policy in the private sector. Nathan has extensive experience in public policy and advocacy at both the state and national level, having previously worked as a senior policy advocate for Business SA and as the Senior Policy Advisor for the Motor Trades Association of Australia. Nathan currently sits on a number of boards and advisory committees, including the Construction Industry Training Board, the Housing and Urban Development Advisory Committee, and the Integrated Design Strategies Establishment Group. Nathan will speak of the theme challenges. So can I ask Nathan to come forward? Population growth is a reality, and our expectations around housing and lifestyle are in a state of constant flux. But with the challenges presented by these changes comes great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Susan. And, I do apologise for my indulgence early on because I've changed the topic of what I'm going to talk about quite dramatically as a consequence of something which happened last week, and that'll all become clear in a minute. I do plan to be agent provocateur today. I do think I'm going to touch on a whole different topic, but it feeds directly into the theme of today of older, poorer and denser. I did have a speech all prepared around urban density, delivering a changed dwelling model that caters for people's needs into the future. I looked at the challenges and the costs and the issues that the industry faces, not insurmountable issues, but issues nonetheless in terms of the taxes and charges that the government levies on apartments versus greenfield development. So that touches on Chris's point. But you know what? I threw all that out because last week I got offered a job to move to Sydney and I took it. And so what I wanted to do today was touch on the bigger issue, which I think is at play in South Australia. And that big issue is actually the biggest issue that the industry or the property industry faces in delivering a changed housing model, which is actually having people who want to buy the properties. Planners do have great plans and they've got wonderful artistic renditions of what it might look like. It used to be sketched out with coloured pencils, now it's done in 3 dimensions. Far better for the community to actually see what it looks like. The government has been doing a great job in actually planning for the future, planning for where people are going to live. But the biggest problem is that we don't actually have anybody coming to South Australia to live in those houses. So that is the big challenge. It's actually the demographic destiny that South Australia faces. Because it's not just me, for example, in my circumstance who's leaving. I'm taking my wife with me, I'm taking my 3-year-old son and my unborn son. So we're all going to go to the East Coast. We know that South Australia's population is growing at a record high over the last decade. It's gone up from 0.7% to 1%. I think Andrew Beer might clarify with me later that that might be incorrect, but I can tell you that is where we're growing. We're growing about 1% a year. That is nowhere near enough. Why isn't it enough? It isn't enough because the property industry requires at least 2% economic growth to grow. We need 2% economic growth in the state to actually start to produce more dwellings that people want. So if we talk about having densification of our CBD or inner rim suburbs, the industry faces massive challenges in actually being able to do that. Once again, I come back to the costs. I come back to the fact that the finance companies require you, or the banks require you to pre-sell about 120% of a development before you can actually get your development finance to get it out of the ground. When you've got a population growth that's growing at 1%, you do not get it. In 2008, we were building about 13,000 new dwellings a year. We're down to projecting building about 8,000 dwellings this year. That is nowhere near enough. If what we want to do is we want to transform South Australia, if we want to be able to provide the services that South Australians want into the future, there is only one simple answer, and that is we need to supercharge population growth. If we can get more people living in South Australia, we can actually start to provide a stronger economy. That stronger economy gives us the capacity to actually deliver more for what South Australians want. You know, we know, for example, I like to call South Australia mendicant state. For every dollar we put into the GST pool, we draw back $1.28. That means we're being subsidised by every other state. That means we should be going over to Victoria and thanking Victorians for paying for our healthcare, for our education, for our roads. Not a terribly popular program. I'm going to release a policy on it. I'm going to call it a Kiss-a-Vic program as opposed to Kick-a-Vic. You know, what we've got here is we've got an absolute challenge in South Australia. We can talk all we want about how we want South Australia to change. We can talk all we want about how we want it to be more sustainable by delivering more apartments in inner rim areas, or more infrastructure, or more healthcare services. But the simple reality is that we do not have the population growth. We do not have enough taxpayers in South Australia to pay for the services that we want. You know, if we want, the last 3 treasurers have talked constantly about the impact that the health budget is having on South Australia, how much of a drain that is. But the reality is when we're bleeding taxpayers, we're not bringing in more taxpayers, we're not going to have the money to pay for that, nor are we going to have the money to pay for the infrastructure services or the public transport services or all of the other things that we need to have to grow into the future. So, you know, my I guess, clarion call is I think that there's a challenge more so than risk. I think that there's a challenge to actually look at how do we get more people in South Australia. I'm pro-growth. I put up my hands. I know Sandra Kanker's here, and she's been a great servant to the people of South Australia for many years in the Legislative Council. I know that she disagrees with me. But, you know, we have a once... Excellent. I'm expecting a lot more. We have an opportunity in South Australia to actually address the challenges we've got. We've got a massive Eurozone crisis happening. We've got major unemployment rates in countries like Portugal, Italy, Ireland and Spain. We have the opportunity to do what our forefathers or our forebearers have done in the past, and that's actually go over to these countries and say to those young, skilled, unemployed people in family formation age, come on over to Australia. Every generation of Australians have done that. All of us sitting in this room, unless you're of Aboriginal origin, your family were migrants. We have an opportunity to do that again, and the benefit of that will actually be driving economic growth in South Australia. We'll be able to pay for the services that we all want into the future. We'll be able to provide the housing that we all want into the future. If we don't, I fear I believe that we'll effectively become, as the title said on the screen before, older, poorer and denser. Thank you.
How we're going to run the last part of the forum is that I'm going to have the privilege of being able to ask a couple of questions of each of the presenters. So can I just start off with you, Andrew, because you talk about poverty, and you talk about it in the context of what's happening in Australia, in South Australia and Adelaide, but is it peculiar to this geography, or is this something that we're seeing really across the nation?
I think it's no secret that South Australia is older and poorer than the nation as a whole, and I think we also have to accept that our economy is restructured more and more quickly than other parts of Australia, largely because we were more highly dependent on manufacturing industries compared to New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, etc. We haven't seen growth in the finance industry or the property services industry in the way that we would have seen in New South Wales or Victoria. So we are poorer, we are older, and the trends are that we'll get older and poorer at a faster rate than the rest of the nation. And we may see greater rates of job loss and higher rates of unemployment as a consequence.
Okay, thank you. Chris, could you just elaborate a little bit more on this idea of we just don't seem to have had much success in Adelaide around high density?
Well, it's not just Adelaide. Although one can go to Melbourne and Sydney and see some quite spectacular areas where there has been higher density, those are areas, particularly Sydney, where there's the sort of population push and economic development driver that Nathan was talking about. I mean, very much the same on the Gold Coast and Brisbane. Adelaide's a lovely place, that's why I've come back here. But it's a bit quiet and sleepy, and it's not really booming. And so without the booming economy, we're not likely to have much push for higher density. I hate to agree so much with Nathan, but I find I do actually.
Can I just have a follow-up question though? Just in terms of what's happening in, say, the UK, what strategies perhaps are they using to be able to increase density that we're not doing here?
Well, the UK is both a good and a bad example. The UK has a very restrictive planning regime, so it's very hard to get planning permission virtually anywhere outside of existing built-up areas. But what this has also tended to do is to push house prices up dramatically, cut back or reduce the level of housing output. The planning can be, as I said in my presentation, extremely good at stopping things happening. What it hasn't been good at is providing affordable homes for young would-be home buyers. So it's a good object lesson, but a good object lesson about how not to do it in many ways.
Nathan, did you want to make a comment?
I think one of the things we don't do very well is actually learning from lessons overseas. So I've run a number of tours over to Europe and the US looking at how they deliver multi-level residential in those places. And one of the things that I think it works really well, particularly in continental Europe, is actually co-op housing, where a group of people who are like-minded in terms of what they want in terms of housing, go off, buy a block of land, secure an architect, get a design done, find a builder and build it for themselves. So in Australia, we tend to rely on the model of, I want a new house or a new apartment, I'll go off and wait for a developer to provide a product that I want, and then I'll go and buy that. Whereas in those countries, they actually go off and do it themselves. And I think there's some regulatory barriers to that happening in Australia that I think if we fix, would actually allow people to take more control and more ownership of what they want to achieve, but also deliver that more dense urban form that I think a lot of us want.
Debbie, can I just ask, in terms of your issue of downsizing, you're saying that really baby boomers aren't doing it, or we thought they would but they're not. What do you think is going on there?
Well, the general understanding sort of within the planning system is that older people will downsize, free up that housing for families, but there's very little evidence. We have very little research into downsizing, into what sort of property people would like, the reasons they want to do it. And at the moment, there are lots of disincentives for downsizing. There are the costs of downsizing, the selling of your house, the agent's fees, the stamp duty. There are disincentives if you're on a pension. If you get money in your account. Now, in the latest budget, there was a program announced that you could sell your house and $200,000 you could put in your bank account for 10 years and it wouldn't count against your pension. That's fine, but the minute you touch that money, it will count against your pension as an asset. So, you know, it's not really an incentive for people to downsize. There's the stress of downsizing and moving, and older people are very satisfied with the houses they have at the moment. So, you know, there would have to be a good variety of houses out there and motivations for them to want to downsize.
Okay. Andrew, could the superannuation scheme that they currently have with the government, could that be a potential panacea for dealing with poverty?
Yes and no.
Thought you were going to say
And
that.
I'm sorry to say that to you. Look, with some research I did with Debbie a couple of years back, we looked at the housing of older South Australians in particular. And one of the things that really came out is that older South Australians who had some superannuation had many, many more options in terms of their housing than those who had no superannuation. But often it wasn't quite enough to give them the full range of options they'd always look for. If you've only had the superannuation guarantee levy through the last 10 or 15 or 20 years of your working life, it's not enough for you to buy into that retirement village that you want. It's not enough to buy in the form of accommodation that you desire. It does give you a few more options, so you're not really at risk of homelessness, but it doesn't provide all the solutions. And in fact, it may well be another 30 years before we have generations that are completely covered by superannuation. And even then, there are significant numbers who will never be covered. People who aren't in the workforce because of disability, because of child-raising responsibilities, or because they're relatively recent migrants. So there's still those gaps even within the existing system.
Okay. Look, Nathan, I know you sort of touched on it before, but could you just elaborate on the challenges the development sector face in delivering an affordable product, but also one that really does deliver the costs down, but it's also quality. It's a quality product as well, because that seems to be the criticism a lot, isn't it, around high-density living? A perception, at least, that it's not good quality.
Yeah, I mean, Chris touched on it before in terms of the cost differential between greenfield and apartments. Broadly, I guess, you know, there are many, many issues around apartments that don't exist for house and land developers. So, number one, most people think that developers are greedy, they're evil, they want to make lots of money. On the whole, that is pretty much true, right? But it's not a bad thing. You know, we all get up in the morning and go to work, and we go to work every day, and at the end of the pay period, we expect to get paid. This is a bit different because what they're doing is they're putting all of their money on the line, and if it doesn't work, they lose it. And I can tell you, I know a lot more developers that lose everything than I know developers that make an absolute bucket load of money. Now, if you're a developer, you would be developing in any other asset class except for multi-level residential, because it just has different fundamentals about it. So from the moment you go out and you buy a site, and chances are you finance the site, you've gone to a bank and you said, I need to borrow a couple of $1 million to buy a site, the holding cost clock starts ticking, right? So you buy the site, you pay your stamp duty on the site, you pay ad valorem, which is a wonderful little tax that the state government charges you to change the name on the title. So for one of my members, for example, he paid $31,000 a letter to change the name on the title, which is an amazing cost. South Australia is a wonderful tax regime. So you've paid your stamp duty, you've paid your ad valorem tax, you'll be paying land tax and stamp duty throughout the life of the project, you'll be paying council rates, you'll be paying emergency services levy, and there's at least 5 or 6 others that I've forgotten. Save the River Murray levy, that's a good one. So you're paying all of these taxes. And at that point, what you then have is you have a site which you're paying holding costs on. Then you go off and you pay an architect, an engineer, a quantity surveyor, and about 6 other different services. And you have to pay these guys for the first 18 months while you go off and get the plans for your development through. Then once you've got your plans prepared, you then pay council to assess those plans. And if you're lucky, it gets through in, say, 3 months. So by this point in the process, you've owned this block of land and paying tax on it for 22 months. Point then you've got is a development approval where you then engage an agent who will go out and sell those apartments. Now, if you're lucky, they sell very quickly. If you're not, it'll probably take you another 12 months to sell every apartment.
And at that point, you can actually then get your development finance. So what are we now? About 32 months into ownership. Then it's going to take you 15 to 18 months to actually build the project. So at that point, you've built the entire building, and then you have to hope that everybody who signed a contract and paid the deposit is actually going to settle on that contract. Now, banks think that about 30% of people won't. So that's your risk margin there. So then you hope that everyone settles. And at that point, you make some money off of the project. Now, every month that holding cost is clicking over is another month that's money that you're not making. Right? So that's why apartments are so expensive. Taking aside the fact it costs you $2,000 more a square metre to build over 3 stories than it does in a greenfield, your holding costs absolutely kill you. So if you're wondering why you can pay $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 for an apartment, it's because the developer is paying the banks, they're paying architects, they're paying engineers, they're paying for the risk. Tell you what, there aren't too many people who make an absolute packet out of building multi-level residential. If there were, I can guarantee you there'd be far more cranes on the skyline. Everyone would be doing it. They're not, and that's the exact reason. And that's also the reason why quite often you might not get the same level of design outcomes, because that all costs money. And the great thing about all of this is, if you buy an apartment in the city, you're paying about $7,000 to the state government in open space contribution, which the government is going to spend somewhere else within the metropolitan area that has no relevance to your development. A couple of my developer members will pay, one of them at the moment is going to pay $2 million into the open space fund. Not 1 cent of that, paid for by the people who buy the apartments, is going to be spent on the public realm around that site. So you're actually paying for the public realm, but it's just, it could be somewhere else. It could be a bicycle path in the city of Onkaparinga. It could be anywhere else. So, the reality is, if people want developers to pay more, then we have to make it a lot easier. We have to make it a lot simpler, and we have to reduce the risk profile. Then they're more than happy to do it. I don't know any developer that wants to produce a worse outcome for South Australia.
Just a follow-up though, Nathan, what about consumers though? How does the developers find a way to change the attitudes of consumers in terms of high density living or apartment living in Adelaide?
I think, in all honesty, it comes with time. I mean, if you go to Sydney, you can justify paying $500,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment because a $500,000 dwelling anywhere nearby just doesn't exist. The only reason you get an apartment market in Melbourne, or you have an apartment market in Melbourne and Sydney, is because the cost of established homes, let's face it, people don't go on a Saturday, right, I'm going to go have a look at an apartment and then I'm going to go out to Gawler and have a look at a house and land package. What they're doing is they're looking at an apartment in the city, and then they're looking at a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom dwelling, or a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom dwelling in Prospect. That's really the comparison. And when you can buy a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, detached or attached, but with a block of land dwelling in Prospect for $500,000, why would you buy an apartment at the same price? What we don't have is a price disparity between existing product and an apartment product. And until we find that there's massive price escalation in established homes in the inner metro area, I really struggle to see how we're going to actually get a viable apartment market that people are going to want.
Okay. Chris, you controversially mentioned that perhaps Adelaide Airport should move. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was surprised when given this topic to think about, and obviously it's an area that I've worked in other countries as well. The Adelaide Airport didn't seem to be on the radar. It's not meant to be a pun in terms of public policy discourse. Now, airports are possibly, well, certainly one of the 2 or 3 most important drivers of economic growth in countries and regions. And airports have huge numbers of spin-off economic activities. Now, given that Adelaide's airport is in a location that was a long way from the CBD by old standards, but is now surrounded by development, and there's a lot of land that could be used, why is no one looking at it? Why are we letting that marvellous redevelopment opportunity pass by? Now, I'm not suggesting we should do anything straight away, because we don't have to. But at some stage in the future, if Adelaide grows, which of course it might not, I mean, the anti-growth lobby might succeed, it might just sort of wither or stabilise, but if it grows, then there will come a time when the airport will need to relocate, or other developments will need to happen. And so it could at least be part of a strategic vision without, I try not to sound too grand and visionising because it can come savagely undone. But why not think about it? Why not free up that land? Why not link it into future infrastructure development of freeways, highways, high-speed transit to a new airport location? Another opportunity that I was discussing with a couple of my colleagues, one of whom wishes to remain nameless, was even to think about going over the hills to link up Adelaide's new airport with what will come eventually, which will be a high-speed rail system linking Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne and Adelaide. And in that sense, maybe not a northern option, but a southeastern option. Let's think about these things at some stage. Could be fun.
Andrew, of course, it's not just about housing, is it? I mean, the challenge for Adelaide now, also with the South Australian economy, is very much about what's happening with the mining boom or not, and of course manufacturing. Do you want to make some comments about what you think the likely impact this is going to have on poverty in South Australia?
I think we need to acknowledge that mining activity has been a strategy for economic growth really back to the first years of the Brown Liberal government, which must have been 1992 or 1994. So it's been a feature of the economic planning in South Australia for a very long time. And we have seen an increase in some forms of activity, but we certainly haven't seen the crescendo of activity that was really forecast up until earlier this year, late last year. And that may well reflect a number of things, including a maturing of the economy and a maturing of demand across the global economy. But I suspect one of the outcomes that has happened and cannot be reversed is that we've seen much of our manufacturing industry decline. We've seen significant structural adjustment with large-scale redundancies in a number of plants. And I suspect those jobs will never come back. Those large-scale industrial jobs in the Mitsubishis of this world will never return. In the year 2000, Mitsubishi Motors Australia Limited employed more than 7,000 people in southern Adelaide. They had 2 large plants, they were running at full capacity, and they were very successful. And the world has changed. And I can't see us returning to a system of tariff protection and other benefits. So the question really has to be, well, where will those jobs be in the future? What will those jobs be? What will they look like? We know they probably won't be full-time paid employment, but they may well be casual and part-time employment. But what industry sectors will they be, and how do we get there? And I think that's the real challenge, because unless we think through that real and fundamental issue, we won't have a future. And I saw earlier in this, earlier this evening that Mike Linden was here. He once talked about Adelaide turning into a large-scale retirement village. And it could be a large-scale retirement village without employment, and that's a real risk. And I think Nathan's highlighted that point as well in his presentation earlier tonight, that there is a real risk that there will be no demand for goods, there will be no demand for services, and stagnation could be a real risk for Adelaide in particular.
Okay. Then Debbie, you mentioned this idea of age-friendly housing. Can you expand on that then in light of the fact that we are going to be this ageing city?
Sure. Well, Australia does have a strategic plan for universally designed housing. Universal design means that it has an easy entrance point, it can be adaptable to changing needs, and it can be adapted to different households who live in that housing. So therefore it makes the housing much more useful for the household that's in there or new households coming in. But universal design is not compulsory. It's hoped that by 2020 that developers and builders will build all of their residential properties to universal design standards. Whether that happens, I think Nathan will say that the Property Council supports universal design, but when it's not compulsory, it's very hard to understand if it really will go ahead.
Thank you. Nathan, we've talked a lot about the older population, but what are the challenges do you think are going to be in terms of meeting the needs of the older population, but we still have a younger generation also who is a housing consumer?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say quickly on universal housing, my CEO is actually chair of Livable Housing Australia and the HIA is on there, so, we're fully on board. The industry actually drove the sustainability agenda with Green Star and delivered those changes, so I do feel that we can do that. There are some significant challenges in housing in terms of creating that sort of ageing in place opportunity whereby people they don't feel like they have to run off to a retirement home as soon as their care needs go up, and the new Living Longer, Living Better aged care reforms at the federal level are going to help with that, so that there'll be funding for in-home services. I think the challenge going forward is actually the intergenerational challenge between the older people who have much of the asset wealth but don't necessarily have the cash, and the younger generation who really want to get in but can't afford the cost of entry. That's really the big challenge in terms of being able to provide dwelling typologies for people at all ages. I have no doubt that the industry will be able to deliver. The industry has been building houses for people at all points in their life. Since time immemorial, since the first houses were developed in South Australia 175 years ago, 176 years ago. The industry is very good at doing that. The question is, can we do it at an affordable price, and can we ensure that we do it in a way where people can actually choose to live there for longer? But we also need to ensure that we remove any roadblocks to people actually getting the type of house that they need at any particular point in their life. And as mentioned before around stamp duty, that is absolutely one of the biggest issues with older people choosing to downsize. I think the New South Wales government introduced almost what they call the last home buyer incentive, where you don't have to pay the stamp duty if you're downsizing. It's quite an ingenious model of actually freeing up assets which you would define, the 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom established house that is more suited to young families who need the space than necessarily older people who don't want to look after their lawns any longer. It's a great way of actually freeing up those assets and allowing assets to transact between the generations. We need to ensure we remove those barriers. It's not just about necessarily delivering new products for them or for those age groups.
All right, thank you. Look, can I ask that you join me in thanking the presenters tonight? I think that they've generated clearly some interesting debate and hopefully more conversations in terms of where we're going in the future in terms of urban living in Adelaide. Thank you.